Is this on? Yeah? Okay, good. So thanks very much for the invitation to talk. This is quite a simple talk in a way, but I think it fits in with the theme of the workshop, which is basically, it's a question of scale. So what I'm going to talk about is unbiased approximations of products of expectations. And I think even just saying that, many of you will think, well, I know how to unbiasedly estimate a product of expectations. And the point of the talk really is that the simple way of doing it does not scale as well as a slightly more sophisticated but still relatively simple way of doing it. Okay? This is joint work with Simone Tiberi, who used to be at Warwick but now is at the University of Zurich, and Giacomo Zanella, who is here, I think, but is now based in Bocconi and also used to be at the University of Warwick. Okay, so the outline is pretty simple. I'll introduce essentially the problem. I'll talk about a few different types of approximations you might use for this problem, and then I will look more at the scaling results, why this is interesting, particularly in the context of latent variable models, and then I'll close with some examples. Okay, so for the context of this talk, we're going to think of x as being a mu distributed random variable, and we'll think of g1 up to gn as being some non-negative functions. So if I write mu of gp, mu of gp is just the integral of gp with respect to mu, or the expectation of gp of x. Okay, and little p runs from 1 up to little n. Little n is essentially the number of terms in this product. So the subject of the talk is to approximate exactly this product, gamma. I'm going to call it gamma, product of these expectations, which is just the product of these mu of gp. And the point, again, is that what we would like is we would like to estimate this, estimate gamma using, or approximate gamma by being able to simulate a non-negative random variable whose expectation is exactly gamma. Okay. And one reason this might arise, I think many people in this audience will be familiar, one reason this might arise is because you might be looking at a latent variable model where x comes from some distribution mu, and y, a random variable, is distributed according to some gx, some Markov transition density g, which depends on x. And of course, in this context, maybe you've observed values of y and you want to conduct inference. Okay, so the marginal density of y is exactly an expectation of g of x for some fixed y. And so the marginal density of i.i.d observations, y1 up to yn, is just a product of these nu of yp's, which is basically something of exactly the form of the gamma that I wrote down previously. So this is to give some context. Why might I want to estimate such a product of expectations? Okay? And in particular, well, first, by noting that the marginal density of these i.i.d observations of this form, the obvious point is just that the likelihood function is also of this form. For each value of theta, you have a gamma, an associated gamma that is a product of expectations. Okay? So assume now that we've observed y1 up to y little n, and we have some unknown statistical parameter theta that we want to infer, then really, I'm not going to do it for the rest of the talk, but basically mu is indexed by some theta and g is indexed by some theta, so that essentially this nu of y can be also indexed by theta, and all of these expectations are indexed by theta. Okay? So the point is that somehow, whereas normally I will just write gamma, you can really think of gamma as a function of theta, which is an appropriate product of expectations. Okay? And I will get to the substance of the approximation soon, but this is all just to sort of motivate why we might care about this problem. One reason is we might want to perform Bayesian inference, where we already know that somehow non-negative unbiased approximations of the likelihood function can be used in a fairly generic and easy way by practitioners to conduct inference. So here, I'm going to assume that you have some posterior density, pi of theta, which is proportional to some prior times this gamma of theta, right? And many of you will be familiar with the fact that these unbiased approximations of gamma of theta will allow us to conduct inference. I'm not going to go into all of the details. It really is as simple in some sense as it sounds, although you have to do it exactly the way it's supposed to be done. But really, these Markov chain methods involve, well, you can run an MCMC method where instead of using the actual gamma of theta, you just plug in the unbiased approximation. So these methods are exact. The only error is Monte Carlo error. Obviously, there are questions about how good the unbiased approximation needs to be for the method to be good, and people have started or have significantly addressed many of those questions already. So I'm not going to go into much about the extensive literature on how we might quantify the performance of these algorithms based on the quality of the unbiased approximations. The most relevant result today is one that I'm about to talk about now, of which both authors are actually in this audience, which is nice. Okay. So in many cases, although it's not the only thing you might consider, in many cases you might be interested in looking at the asymptotic variance of some ergodic average associated with this pseudo-marginal Markov chain, which is just written like this. This is basically little n. Well, sorry, I put the limit on the wrong side. It's the limit as n goes to infinity of n times the variance of your ergodic average. Okay. So this paper by Christoph Andrew and Matti Vihula, they basically compare the variance, the asymptotic variances associated with two different pseudo-marginal kernels. And basically, if you think of two different unbiased approximation random variables, which depend on some theta, L1 and L2, associated with P1 and P2, then if L1 of theta is convex ordered with respect to L2 of theta for every theta, then you know that the asymptotic variance associated with the first pseudo-marginal kernel will be better than or smaller than the asymptotic variance associated with the second one. Okay, for all L2 functions. So for those of you who don't know much about or are not familiar with convex ordered, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it. In fact, it's quite a natural concept. Basically, X is convex ordered with respect to some random variable Y if the expectation of phi of X is less than or equal to the expectation of phi of Y for all convex functions phi. Okay, and the middle bit is just saying that basically, if you're convex ordered, it means that two random variables being convex ordered implies that they have the same expectation, and also it implies that their variances are ordered in the appropriate way. Okay. The more interesting intuitive thing somehow is that X is convex ordered with respect to Y if there exists a probability space with random variables X prime, Y prime, and another random variable Z prime. X prime is equal in distribution to X, and Y prime is equal in distribution to Y. And you can write somehow that the expectation of Y prime given Z prime is equal to X prime, right? So in some sense, it means that Y prime, or Y, you could think of Y, the original Y, as being like X multiplied by some mean one random variable. Okay, so it's necessarily more random in some sense, right? Because you take one random variable, you multiply it by another random variable. Okay, so that's just the setup. So somehow the relevance for the rest of this talk is that at least in some settings we're going to see that we can construct a sort of, some convex ordered approximations of the likelihood function. Okay, so on this slide you probably can see what you've already thought of as the simple way to approximate a product of expectations. For all of this talk, it's going to be the case that we consider having capital N random variables, zeta 1 up to zeta n, i.i.d, and distributed according to mu. Okay, this sort of sets the scene for the results. Of course, you could imagine approximating expectations in a huge variety of ways, but this sort of makes it simpler to. It's related to practice, and it sets up how you might analyze the algorithm. Okay, so for the simple approximation, what we'll assume is that capital N is some multiple of little n, and essentially what you're going to do is take a product of independent random variables, each of which are averages that approximate one of the expectations. Okay. So essentially, you approximate mu of G1 using an average, you approximate mu of G2 using an average, mu of G3 using an average, all using independent random variables, and then you take their product, and you're good in some sense. Right? Okay. So it's very simple to see that this simple estimator it's unbiased, it has the right expectation, it converges in probability as capital N goes to infinity. Of course, you can say stronger things as well. And you can look at its second moment, or its relative second moment, and it's basically a product of 1 plus mu of g bar p squared minus 1 over capital M. So this is sort of the second moment, the relative second moment of GP under mu, and you get this sort of, well, this product. And you can see that as little n grows, you know, as capital N stays fixed, then this will grow exponentially quickly, right? Whereas, you know, if you increase capital M with little n linearly, then you can control this kind of, you can control this second moment. Okay. But anyway, this is exact. This is an exact expression for the second moment, and the variance is finite if and only if you actually have a second moment for the GPs, for all of the GPs. Okay. Okay, so one problem with the simple approximation, of course, it's simple, it's nice, it's easy to use, you know, it's hard to mess up. At the same time, in a context, so now let's start thinking about a context where actually simulating the random variables is very expensive, right? So we don't want to, well, ideally we don't want to simulate too many random variables, and if we have simulated those random variables, the zeta 1 up to capital N, we would like to use them as much as possible, not just, you know, waste them like we do in the simple estimator by throwing away, you know, once we've estimated mu of G1, we don't look at zeta 1 up to zeta M anymore. Okay. So the biased approximation is basically just, well, it's kind of even simpler than the simple approximation in some sense. You just use all of the random variables in each term in the product, okay? So these random variables, so these terms in the product are no longer independent, so actually, it's actually quite easy to see that the estimator is biased, but it's still consistent. So, you know, you can use it in some context, and actually when we started this project, I was talking to Simone, and for his application, he was using this estimator because, well, it doesn't lead to a normal pseudo-marginal chain, but at least it was working in practice. At least he could actually solve, well, he could get answers for the problem he was interested in a reasonable amount of computational time. Okay. So the motivation then is to seek a way to maybe fix this kind of estimator or fix this kind of approximation to make it unbiased, but still use most of the samples. Okay. So one way that you can go about looking for such a solution is to maybe look at simple, this is a very simple example of a U statistic, right? So if you express gamma as a product of expectations, then that's fairly simple. You can also express it as an expectation of a product of GP of independent random variables x1 up to xn. Okay? So that's fairly simple. So then a U statistic of order little n for this kind of quite simple expectation is to actually look at this look at this expression. This is a sum over all, well, it's an average over all of little n permutations of capital N of the product of GP zeta kp. Okay. So basically, you look at all possible distinct assignments of integers from 1 to capital N. You take little n of them, and you take a product of the associated GP of zeta, those indexed random variables. Okay. So by construction, it's a U statistic. This is an unbiased estimator of gamma, and of course, it also is convex ordered with respect to gamma simple. So this is not obvious, but in a way, you can think of gamma simple as you've sort of blocked up your random variables, and you take a product associated with each block. And if you look at this estimator or this approximation, it's kind of like looking at all possible blocks. Okay. So those of you in the audience who are familiar with these types of expressions will probably already see, well, this is not computationally possible to compute in practice. And indeed, the reason it's called gamma perm n is because basically it's a scaled version of the permanent of a fairly big matrix. Okay. So while gamma perm n, this approximation, is less noisy than gamma n simple, it's proportional to the permanent of a rectangular matrix with entries aij being gi zeta j. Okay. And there's no known polynomial time algorithm for computing basically this kind of permanent. It's known that computing the permanent of a square matrix is sharply hard. That was quite a important contribution in the late 70s. And as far as I know, there are no results to suggest that computing the permanent for rectangular matrices is any different. Nevertheless, there are sort of algorithms for approximating or unbiasedly approximating permanents. In particular, there was one in 1996. This is one of the simplest estimators for approximating the permanent of a square matrix. And here we just extend essentially the proposal to rectangular matrices. So it's very simple. It's very simple to extend, right? And essentially you can already see, well, hopefully you can see that it's very much like gamma biased n, except that there are some exclusions, okay? So if I just look at the approximation, gamma recycle n, it's once again like an average, but over n minus p plus 1 random variables, n minus p plus 1 of the zeta. Okay, and the exclusions depend on these k1 up to kn, and these are themselves random variables whose distribution is defined by the sequence of conditional probabilities, so that basically, well, maybe it's good to look at the first one. So if I look at the first term here, it's going to be 1 over capital N times the sum of all of the GP of the zetas, okay? And then I'm going to then sample, say, k1, which is going to be sampled proportional to G1 of all of the zetas, right? Okay, and then I'm going to move to step 2, and then I'm take 1 over n minus 1 of the sum of the GPs of all of the zetas except zeta k1, okay? So I randomly exclude the sort of one of the chosen random variables, and you kind of proceed in this manner, okay? In the sense that n minus p plus 1 random variables are used to approximate each expectation, and there's some randomness in these exclusions. Okay. I have a little bit about it later. There was actually some interesting work, you know, if some of you are already thinking about, there are better importance sampling estimators for approximating the permanent of a square matrix. That's true, but in fact, so one of them is by Koo and McCullough. In fact, those algorithms are particularly good for square matrices, but they're not better for rectangular matrices, because they make use of the fact that for a square matrix, in some sense, you want to pick, well, I can get into the details later, but you know that you're going to pick both columns and rows when you choose these Ks, whereas for a rectangular matrix, you don't pick every column. Okay. That's a bit of a technical point. That's just to dissuade people who are going to say there's much better estimators of the permanent, at least in the square case. Okay, so why is it unbiased? Well, it's an important sampling estimator of the permanent, or gamma perm n anyway. So in some sense, you're just taking the average. This is the estimator, and this is the probability mass function for the chosen case. Okay, so it's just a question of a lot of cancellation, and you obtain that the expectation of gamma recycle n given the random variables that you've simulated is exactly gamma perm n. Okay. So of course, this means that this sort of recycled version or recycled approximation has the right expectation, and also you can even see that it's convex ordered with respect to gamma perm. So, it's worse than gamma perm, but maybe it's not as bad as the simple one. Okay. It's also not too hard to show that it converges, well, it's consistent, it converges in probability to gamma as capital N goes to infinity, for a fixed little n, of course. And you can come up with a new condition, a new necessary and sufficient condition for finiteness of the variance. And for those of you who remember the condition for the simple estimator, you can see that this is actually a sort of stricter condition than for the simple estimator. So it's already the case that you can see that this sort of more sophisticated estimator will not always be better than the simple estimator, but I will show for the remainder of the talk that it is much better in sort of some situations that you would be interested in. The specific details of this expression are probably not so important to look at, just that, it's easy for this to be infinite even when all of the second moments are finite, in principle. Okay, so the point of the scalability is really to talk about the scaling of the variance with little n, and for this we just make some minor assumptions so that we know what we're talking about. I'm going to define c little p to be the sort of second moment of GP, the relative second moment of GP minus 1, and I'm going to assume that all of these CPs are sort of upper and lower bounded They're lower bounded by something bigger than 1, so that it's interesting, and they're not, and they're upper bounded by some finite constant. Okay. In this case, as I alluded to previously, it's quite easy to see that for the simple estimator, you need to take capital N of order little n, which means that the total number of random variables, capital N is equal to m times little n, is basically order n squared, little n squared. So you need in total little n squared random variables to stabilize the variance as little n goes to infinity. Okay? So for gamma simple, this is very simple. Everyone knows in some sense how that random variable scales, its second moment scales. For this recycled random variable or recycled approximation, there are some interactions, so it's a bit less simple, and that's where some of the analysis of the paper's gone into. You can make some simple types of analysis just looking at sort of specific cases, like what properties of the G's do I have? If they're mutually independent, which means that the expectation of G1, G2 is basically the expectation of G1 times the expectation of G2, which is a statistically not interesting assumption for the most part, then you can see that the second moment scales like this, which is of course much better than the simple estimator because you have an n minus p plus 1 in the denominator, as opposed to m, right? And m is sort of capital N divided by little n. What's this one? Yeah, so this is just to show, so in that case, in fact, then you can already see that this scales well in this scenario, because if you take capital N to be alpha times little n for any alpha greater than 1, then you can easily get this kind of bound that you've already stabilized. You've already stabilized the second moment. So really, to stabilize the relative variance of this approximation, you just need to take capital N being linear in little n, okay, instead of quadratic. So there are some other scenarios you can look at. You can look at the orthogonal GPs. This is the case where, if GP of x, where the product of GP and GQ of x is always going to be 0 as long as P is not equal to Q, then you can recover the same kind of scaling, except that it's even better than that. Okay. And you can also see that in some cases you're not going to achieve fantastic scaling. So in particular, in the case where all of these G's are the same, so G1, G2, and so on are all equal to some G, then you can see that not even just for this recycled estimator, in fact, even if you could compute the permanent, you would see that the second moment is greater than or equal to this 1 plus Cp to the n squared, or 1 plus C1, whatever you like, to the n squared over capital N. So clearly you need to take capital N being order n squared to stabilize that. Okay. So these are a bit funny in that statistically, all of these scenarios that I've talked about are a little bit strange. What I'm going to show now is that one of the interesting things about this project is that in latent variable models, you're basically essentially in this scenario on average. Okay? So we revisit this case where x comes from mu and y, conditional upon x, comes from little g, and we write nu to be the density of y, which is the expectation of g of x and y, and we look at the expected second moment of the sort of relative approximation. Okay, and if we define this sort of expectation of the second moment with respect to y, which is the latent, y, which is the random variable or the data, the random variable associated with the data, then we will assume that this expected second moment is finite, which is actually not a very strong assumption, but it's not always satisfied. Okay, then it's not too hard to see that the expected, that the second moment of the approximation will be finite for nu almost all y1 up to yn. So, as long as this condition is satisfied, you're kind of in good shape for actually using this type of estimator. And this condition, at least in some models, you can actually verify it quite easily. Okay. So the main result is on the next slide. I don't need to go into the details of this. On the next slide, so in some sense, the main result is exactly this. You have if you look at the expected with respect to y1 up to yn, the expected second moment of the approximation relative second moment of the approximation, then you get this product of 1 plus c over n minus c plus 1, where c is this expected second moment. Okay? So it's a very clean expression. Somehow a lot of things have disappeared in a very nice way. And in some sense, although it's not true, obviously, in any sort of literal sense, it's almost as if the random variables g1 up to gn in this latent variable setting are mutually independent, even though they clearly won't be in practice. Okay? So if you can, in this context, you can easily compare with the simple estimator, which has this kind of expression, 1 plus capital C divided by capital M, all to the power little n, and you can see that this will scale much better than this because capital N is basically m times little n. Okay, so I'm just going to close with some examples. In some sense, this is all about scaling, and sometimes, I mean, for some people, it will be clear that sort of getting the answer using little n times less random variables is much better, but for some others, I mean, I don't have actually quantitative results to show you, but I can tell you that on the examples that I'm running, it really is little time. Using this recycled estimator does take little n times less time to get good answers from your Markov chain algorithm. Okay. Of course, I just need a little bit of setup to explain some of the examples. So to obtain good results for our applications, we follow these generic and useful guidelines of Doucet, Pitt, Delianidis, and Cohn, and also Sherlock, Terry, Roberts, and Rosenthal, which, well, they provide similar guidelines. It's the spirit of the guidelines that I think matters more than the specific numbers that are given, because they differ. But the idea is to choose somehow a capital N such that the relative variance is somehow not too close to 0, but also a bit, not too close to 0, but not too big. So around 2, I mean, some people would say 3. It depends very much on your application. And we also use random walk pseudo-marginal Markov chains with a tuned proposal covariance matrix according to the guidelines of the optimal scaling literature, but are quite, well, they were definitely very useful for these applications. Okay. And this is really the point which somehow I don't need to dwell too much on when I look at the actual applications. In order to obtain this type of stability of the relative variance, you really need to take capital N to be little n times larger. And in some sense, this is also what motivated this work, because when Simone told me that he was using the biased approximation instead of the simple approximation, it was precisely because he couldn't run the chain to get an answer in a reasonable amount of time. Right? It would take half a year or a year to even get preliminary results. Okay. But I can tell you that all of the results I'll show you the results for the recycled estimate. They're almost identical for the two chains, except that I haven't yet been able to run the chain using the simple estimator for long enough, you know, to correspond to how long I've run the recycled estimator chain. Okay, so the first example is the one that actually Simone was telling me about. It's about single cell gene expression, where in the mid-90s, Picoud and Eckhart proposed a continuous time birth and death process in what they call a random environment, but it's just like a switching, continuous time birth death process. I explain a little bit some of the details. This is a very nice model, and it has a lot of experimental support according to the biology literature. So in this model, a cell is either active, which means it's transcribing mRNA, or it's inactive, which means it's not transcribing mRNA. The rates of switching between the active and the inactive state are k on and k off, and when the cell is active, the rate of transcription is lambda. So we assume that mRNA degrades with rate 1, because in some sense, if you give it a different rate, you're just dividing all of these other rates by that quantity. So if you look at the stationary distribution of this process, which was derived in this 1995 paper, then it's equivalent to if you, or you can simulate exactly from the stationary distribution of this process, if you simulate S from a beta distribution with parameters k on and k off, and you simulate X from a Poisson distribution with rate gamma times S. Okay. So that's quite nice. What it means in this context is that simulating, well, if you were to observe noisy observations of mRNA levels, then you don't need to use, coupling from the past or whatever to simulate stationary samples from your Markov chain. You can just sample from this. So here we observe 1,000 independent cells mRNA levels with Gaussian noise. This is quite a simple model using synthetic data with these values of the parameters. And I assume anyway that I know the noise level just to make the inference more interesting in some sense. And we put independent exponential priors on gamma, k on, and k off. And the tuning, as I alluded to earlier, you need to tune things so that the approximate relative variance is not too large and not too small. It resulted in taking capital N being 20 times little n. Okay. So if you were to look at the simple estimator, this would be 20 times little n squared, right, that you would need to take. So instead of 20,000, you would need 20 million, right? Okay, so we ran the chain for 3 times 10 to the 6 iterations. In some sense, that's longer than you would need to get good estimates, but you want to, make sure that your posteriors look as good as possible when you're going to present this and show people. Well, it depends on what you want to estimate, right? If you want to get a shape of the distribution, then you want, to run it for a long time. If you just wanted to estimate the posterior means, you wouldn't need to do it for so long. So here's the posterior density estimates for lambda. You can see that 500 is here, which is the true value, and you have quite a bit of uncertainty still, even though you've had 1,000 observations. For k on, 2 is the real value here, and you have quite a nice distribution there. And here 8 is the real value, which is over here. And again, you've got a nice shape for the distribution. You have nice ideas about your uncertainty in principle. And in the sort of labels, I've given the posterior mean estimate with sort of an estimate of the standard error using the MCMC-SE package. So I believe Judith Kvatz is one of the co-authors, and she's here as well. Yeah. Okay, so I mean those are quite useful. So obviously you can see that the posterior mean is estimated much more accurately than anyway the variance that you would expect to see in the actual posterior. Okay. So anyway, you can solve that kind of problem certainly using these type of methods in a much quicker time. So for the G and K distribution, this is a second example, and it's sort of an example often used in the ABC literature. The setup is somehow that there's a this is one of the distributions for which you can calculate the quantile function, but you can't calculate the density, okay, which lends itself sort of nicely to ABC methods, because knowing the quantile function means that you can simulate random variables according to, well, with this distribution very easily. Okay, so the statistical parameters are A, B, G, and K. I mean, it's not very interesting to look at this expression, but this is just to tell you that this is A, this is B, this is G, and this is K, some exponent. And I've used the same values that were used in Allingham et al., but also a series of other ABC papers all use these parameter settings. And of course, the idea is that we assume that this is a latent variable model where xp is distributed according to mu theta naught, and we observe some yp, which is basically a uniform random variable with mean xp and epsilon on either side. Okay. So one difference that we consider here, I mean, we could of course use more. We consider little n being only 100, which is much less than Allingham et al. And in some sense, one of the nice things about this methodology, as opposed to some other types of ABC methodologies, what you avoid, in some sense, is actually summarizing your individual data points, because you actually calculate, well, on the unsummarized data, you approximate the product of the expectations that are involved in the likelihood function. Okay, so I think it's quite interesting. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's going to be better than summarizing your data when you have appropriate summary statistics in the ABC setting, but it's, if you really don't know how to do the summarization, or you're very uneasy about doing it, then you can try and use this kind of method. So there are not very strong connections, but I thought I would mention that some other people have also been looking at, that's an incomplete bullet point. Some other people have been looking at ways to try and avoid explicit summarization in the ABC setting using different types of distances to measure the discrepancy between simulated and observed data. And again, So we've implicitly adopted the noisy ABC framework of Fernet and Prangle in this setting, which is to say that when we simulated the data, we simulated a bunch of data from this G and K distribution, and then we perturbed it with uniform noise, right, before running the inference. This way you know that you're calibrated, right? At least if you had a well-specified model, you would be calibrated. Okay. So tuning for this example resulted in n is equal to 100 times little n. So again, if we were using the simple estimator, that would be 10,000 times 100. And we ran the chain in this case for 10 million iterations. You can already see also that it's clear that simulating the random variables involves executing this function, whereas calculating the g functions is basically doing a if. So the simulation is much more expensive than calculating the g functions. Okay. So here are some estimates of here are some posterior density estimates, along with estimates of the posterior mean with approximate standard deviations. You can see that you've captured, well, all of the true values of the parameter are captured within these posterior density estimates, but also the posterior density estimates tell you, well, they give you a lot of nice information about the inference that you're trying to conduct. Okay, so A and B look relatively standard. This, the posterior density for G has this interesting bimodal structure, which you also obtain when you use more data. In fact, all of these plots don't look that different to the estimates people have got by Allingham using 1,000 data points, which is 10 times more data. Although I haven't looked to see exactly what the discrepancies are. Okay, it's worth knowing that recently people have started talking about the fact that you could not calculate exactly the likelihood function, but you could use sort of finite differences in combination with explicit computation of the CDF to almost calculate the likelihood function. And in that case, you don't get this kind of weird behavior for the G. So it looks like the use of ABC and this uniform perturbation of the data does result in this more difficulty in identifying little g, but it's not so relevant for the rest of this talk. Okay, so those are just two examples. Certainly, these are examples which, even though they're already quite simple, it's much more feasible to run the analysis if you use the recycled estimator rather than the simple estimator. So just to close, I should also make clear that there is something you should bear in mind, which is that if it was the case that simulating the random variables was very cheap, but calculating the g functions is expensive, then this doesn't help you, right? Because you still calculate the g function n times little n times, even if you're recycling your random variable. There are many extensions possible. I did mention before that there are different estimators of the permanent which you could use. The one of Koo and McCullough is very good for square matrices. I believe it's basically still the state of the art for approximating the permanent and square matrices. If you use it for this problem, in fact, it's much worse than just the simple Kuznetsov estimator of the permanent, and it's precisely because you're not. It's very well adapted to the square matrix case. There are other algorithms for approximating permanents. In particular, there's an SMC algorithm, which it's of course very expensive, right? So those approaches might be interesting in some contexts where the simulation of the random variables was incredibly expensive compared to the computation of the potentials. It's a free game, right? I mean, if you make things more expensive on the one end, you're more motivated to use more sophisticated algorithms on the other. There are other simple things you can do. You can look at the changing the order of the GPs, and something which is, of course, much more difficult to do is to try and analyze the case where you're actually looking at a product of expectations with, where at least normally you would think of them as expectations of functions of different random variables, or random variables with different distributions. You can, of course, always re-express them as products of expectations with respect to the same random variable, using importance sampling ideas. But you may lose something in doing this, right? Of course, once you do this, you can recycle them, but maybe you would have been better off having the nice random variables to begin with. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Okay, so we've got a couple of minutes for questions. Okay, So we've got coffee outside now, and we'll come back again at 11. But we just thank the speakers again for the session.